The old house was always quiet in the mornings, a sleeping giant holding its breath. This was the time he liked best. He moved through the long hallways, his worn sneakers making no sound on the cold, marble floors. He was a ghost in the machine, a necessary part that no one really saw. His name was Leo, and for 15 years, he had been the janitor for the Sterling family. To the family, he was just the janitor. They never used his name. They would just say, "Have the janitor fix that," or tell the janitor to be careful with the vase. He didn't mind. It was easier this way. It meant he could go about his work without being drawn into their world, a world that felt as cold and hard as the marble he cleaned every single day. His routine was the same every morning. Start in the kitchen, then move to the dining room, and finally, the grand ballroom. The ballroom was his favorite and least favorite place all at once. It was a huge room with a ceiling so high you could shout and your voice would get lost in the echoes. And in the center of it all, like a black, polished jewel, was the piano. It was a Steinway, a grand piano that probably cost more than every house on the street he grew up on combined. It was beautiful. The black wood was so shiny you could see your face in it, and the white keys seemed to glow in the soft morning light that came through the tall windows. Every morning, Leo would take a special cloth and gently wipe the dust from its smooth surface. He never played it. He just cleaned it. But his fingers would linger on the cool wood just a second too long. In his mind, he could feel the shape of the keys beneath his rough, work-worn hands. He could almost hear the music. Once, a long time ago, before life got complicated and hard, music had been his whole world. He could still remember the feeling of sitting at a much smaller, much older piano in his small apartment, his fingers flying across the keys, lost in a world of melody. He had been good, people had said. Good enough to maybe go somewhere. But life had other plans. A sick mother, bills that needed paying, and a sister who needed help. Dreams, he learned, don't pay the rent. So the music got packed away, just like an old book you promised to read again someday but never do. Now the only music he made was the quiet swish of his mop or the jingle of his keys. This morning, as he polished the piano, he heard a sound from the top of the grand staircase. It was the girl, Isabel. She was 17, and she moved through the house with the same quiet unhappiness as Leo. She was a beautiful girl, with long, dark hair and eyes that seemed to be looking at something far away. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, but Leo saw something else. He saw the same invisible walls around her that he felt around himself. She came down the stairs, her school books in her arms, and walked towards the ballroom. She didn't say good morning. She never did. She just walked past him, a faint scent of expensive perfume following her, and sat down on the piano bench. It was time for her practice. Her mother, Mrs. Sterling, appeared a moment later. She was a tall, elegant woman who always looked perfectly put together, like she had just stepped out of a salon. She stood behind her daughter, her arms crossed, her expression serious. "Choppin'," she said, her voice sharp and clear in the big room. "Start with the nocturne. And remember what your teacher said about the dynamics. More feeling, Isabel." Isabel didn't look back. She just nodded her head once, her back straight and stiff. She placed her fingers on the keys, her hands perfectly positioned. Then she began to play. The notes that came out were perfect. Every single one was in the right place at the right time. It was clean, precise, and technically brilliant. It was also completely empty. It was like listening to a robot play a song. There was no happiness, no sadness, no soul. It was just sound. Leo continued to work, quietly dusting a tall bookshelf in the corner of the room. He tried not to listen, but the music filled the whole space. He could feel the tension in the girl's shoulders. He could see it in the way her hands struck the keys. She wasn't playing music. She was completing a task. She was just trying to get it right so her mother would be happy when she finished the piece. The last note hung in the air for a second and then disappeared. There was a short silence. "Better," Mrs. Sterling said, but her voice didn't sound pleased. "Your tempo was still a little rushed in the middle. You're not concentrating. Do it again. And this time, try to make it sound beautiful." Isabel's hands balled into small fists on her lap for just a moment. Leo saw it. He saw the flash of frustration in her eyes before she hit it. She took a deep breath, straightened her back again, and placed her fingers back on the keys. Leo looked away. He felt a strange pang of sympathy for the girl. She lived in this huge, beautiful house with everything a person could ever want, but she looked just as trapped as he was. Her cage was just a lot fancier. Her music had no life in it because, he guessed, her life had no life in it. It was all rules and practice and being perfect for other people. He knew what that felt like. He had stopped his music for other people too. The difference was he had a choice. He wasn't sure she did. He quietly finished his work in the ballroom and slipped out of the room, leaving the girl to her perfect empty music and her cold, critical mother. As he walked down the hallway, he could hear the Chopin nocturne start again, still as perfect and as lifeless as before. He shook his head slowly. A beautiful piano, a talented girl, and not a single drop of real music between them. It was a shame, he thought. A real shame. The weeks passed, each one blurring into the next, a quiet cycle of cleaning and watching. Leo continued his daily ritual of polishing the grand piano, and every morning he would hear the girl, Isabel, practice her perfect, lifeless music. The tension in the house felt thick, like a heavy fog that never lifted. Then, one Saturday, the fog turned into a storm of activity. It was the night of the Sterling's annual summer gala. For Leo, this meant a long, busy evening. He started his work in the afternoon, helping the caterers set up tables and carry in heavy trays of food. The house, usually so quiet and still, was filled with people shouting orders and the clatter of equipment. By the time the guests started to arrive, the mansion had been transformed. The ballroom was filled with round tables covered in white linen, and tiny, twinkling lights had been wrapped around the pillars. It looked like something out of a movie. As the first guests arrived, Leo slipped into his usual role of being invisible. He wore a simple black suit, but he might as well have been wearing a cloak of invisibility. The guests, all dressed in their fancy clothes and sparkling jewelry, would walk right past him without a second glance. They were too busy laughing and talking, their voices echoing in the grand hallways. Leo moved among them, a silent shadow, collecting empty glasses from tables and making sure the food trays stayed full. He saw the world of the rich and powerful up close, and it didn't seem all that different from his own. They smiled and shook hands, but their eyes often looked tired or bored. They talked about money and business, and Leo heard snippets of conversations that meant nothing to him. He felt like an alien on a strange planet, observing the customs of its inhabitants. He saw Isabel, too. She was wearing a beautiful blue dress that matched her eyes, but she didn't look happy. She stood beside her parents, a forced smile plastered on her face as she was introduced to one important guest after another. She looked like a doll on display, pretty and polite, but with no life inside her. Leo felt that same pang of sympathy for her that he always did. She was just a part of the evening's decoration, just like the flowers or the twinkling lights. Later in the evening, after dinner was served, it was time for Isabel's performance. Her father, a tall man with a loud voice, tapped a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent. "And now," Mr. Sterling boomed, a proud smile on his face, "my daughter Isabel will play for us." Isabel walked to the piano, her back straight, and sat down on the bench. The room was quiet, all eyes on her. Leo stood near the back of the room, holding a tray of empty glasses, watching. She took a deep breath and began to play. It was the same Chopin nocturne her mother had made her practice over and over. And just like in the mornings, the music was perfect. Every note was clear and precise. Her fingers danced across the keys with a skill that few people could ever hope to achieve. But there was still no feeling. It was a beautiful sound, but it was an empty one. Leo watched the faces of the guests. Some looked impressed, some looked bored, and some were just whispering to each other, not really listening at all. They were just waiting for it to be over so they could go back to their conversations. When she finished, there was a polite smattering of applause. Isabel stood up and gave a small, stiff bow. As she walked back towards her parents, Leo saw her mother meet her by the edge of the crowd. "It was acceptable," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice low but sharp enough for Leo to hear from a few feet away. "But your tempo was rushed in the middle section, just like it always is. You lack discipline. It disappoints me." Leo saw the girl's face fall. The forced smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep hurt and frustration. For a moment she just stood there, her hands clenched at her sides. Then she looked up at her mother, her eyes flashing with a fire Leo had never seen before. "I'm tired of it," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm tired of practicing. I'm tired of performing. I'm tired of being your little performing monkey." Her mother looked shocked, her mouth opening slightly. "Isabel, what has gotten into you? Don't you dare cause a scene in front of our guests?" But Isabel didn't back down. "I don't care," she said, her voice a little louder now. A few nearby guests turned to look, their expressions curious. "I hate it. I hate the piano, and I hate this." Without another word, she turned and walked quickly away, pushing past her father, who was coming over to see what was wrong. She disappeared through the crowd and headed out the large glass doors that led to the terrace. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling stood there for a moment, looking embarrassed and angry. They quickly composed themselves and turned to their guests, forcing smiles and apologizing for their daughter's indisposition. The awkward moment passed quickly. The guests, sensing the tension, turned their attention elsewhere. A band started playing softly in the corner, and people began to drift out onto the terrace, where a fireworks display was about to begin. The ballroom began to empty. Leo found himself alone, standing just a few feet from the grand piano. The stool was still warm from Isabel's presence. The fallboard, the cover that goes over the keys, was left open. The piano was just sitting there, silent and waiting. He could hear the distant pops of the first fireworks beginning outside, and the oohs and ahs of the guests on the lawn. He should have gone back to work. He should have started clearing the dessert plates. But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He looked at the piano, the black and white keys seeming to call to him. He thought about the girl's words. "I hate the piano." And he thought about his own life, a life where he had packed away his own dreams. He felt a strange connection to her in that moment, two prisoners in the same beautiful cage, separated by a world of wealth and status. He took a step closer. Then another. He looked around the room. It was almost completely empty. Everyone was outside, watching the fireworks. His heart was beating fast in his chest. This was crazy. It was a terrible idea. He could lose his job. He could lose everything, but the music was inside him, a ghost that had been rattling around for decades, begging to be let out. He thought about the feeling of his fingers on the keys, the way the notes would come together to create something beautiful, something that could express all the things he couldn't say in words. He thought about the empty, perfect music Isabel had played, and he felt a sudden, powerful urge to fill the silence with something real. He placed his tray of glasses on a nearby table. The sound of the fireworks grew louder, painting the sky in bursts of color that were visible through the tall windows. In the flashes of light, the piano seemed to glow. He took one last look around, then walked over and sat down on the bench. It felt strange and wonderful. He slowly, hesitantly, lifted his hands and placed his rough, worn fingers on the smooth ivory keys. They felt like home. For a long moment, he just sat there, his fingers resting on the cool ivory keys. The world outside the ballroom seemed to fade away. The distant pops of the fireworks became a dull, rhythmic beat, like a heart. He could feel the history of the piano beneath his hands, the thousands of hours of perfect practice notes that Isabel had played. But he also felt something else, a deeper, older spirit that was waiting to be woken up. His mind was a battlefield. One side was screaming at him to get up. Asterisk, what are you doing? You'll lose your job? You'll be out on the street. These people are not your kind. Asterisk, it was the voice of common sense, the voice that had guided his entire life, the voice that had told him to put his dreams away and get a real job. But the other side of his mind was quiet. It was a feeling more than a voice. It was the memory of his mother's smile when he would play for her on their old, rickety, upright piano. It was the feeling of the music flowing through him, a language more powerful than words. It was the ghost of the boy he used to be, the boy who believed that music could change the world, or at least a small part of it. He looked at his hands. They were not the hands of a pianist. They were the hands of a janitor. The knuckles were swollen, the nails were short and broken, and the skin was rough and calloused from years of scrubbing floors and handling harsh chemicals. These were hands that knew the feel of a mop, not the delicate touch required for a Steinway. What right did he have? But then he thought of the girl's face, the flash of anger and hurt in her eyes. "I hate the piano," she had said. He understood. She didn't hate the instrument. She hated what it represented. She hated the pressure, the perfection, the emptiness. And in that moment, he felt a powerful urge to show her, to show everyone what the piano could truly be. It wasn't a machine for producing perfect notes. It was a living thing, a vessel for the soul. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he pressed down a single key. A low, clear C note rang out in the silent room. The sound was rich and full, vibrating through the wooden bench and up his spine. It was a sound so pure and beautiful that it made his heart ache. He held the note for a moment, letting it hang in the air. A single, perfect question, then he began to play. He didn't start with a difficult, showy piece. He chose a simple melody, a song his mother used to hum to him when he was a child. It was a tune he hadn't played in years, but his fingers remembered it. They moved slowly at first, hesitantly, feeling their way across the keys. The sound was not perfect. There were no fancy flourishes or complex chords. It was just a simple, honest melody, but as he played, something began to happen. The years of dust and neglect on his soul started to fall away. The music began to flow more freely. He closed his eyes, and he was no longer a janitor in a mansion. He was just a man and a piano. He was the boy in the small apartment playing for his mother. He was the teenager dreaming of a stage. He was the man who had lost everything. Finding a piece of it again in the most unexpected of places, the simple melody began to grow, to change. He started to improvise, weaving in fragments of the Chopin nocturne he had heard Isabel play. But he played it differently. He played it with all the feelings she had been forced to suppress. He played the sadness, the frustration, the longing. He poured all of his own life into the music, the hard labor, the quiet loneliness, the secret hopes he had never told anyone. The music drifted out of the ballroom, through the open doors of the terrace. At first, no one noticed. The guests were busy watching the fireworks, which were now reaching their grand finale. The sky was a riot of color and sound, but the melody had a quality that cut through the noise. It was a thread of pure emotion in a night of artificial spectacle. A young woman, standing near the edge of the terrace, was the first to hear it. She stopped talking mid-sentence, her head tilted to the side. "Do you hear that?" she asked her companion. "Hear what?" "The fireworks?" "No, the music." Her companion listened, and then he heard it too. It was a faint, haunting sound coming from inside the house. One by one, people began to fall silent. The conversations quieted down. The band, who had been playing soft jazz in the corner, also stopped, their own instruments silent as they listened to the mysterious melody. The guests began to turn away from the fireworks and drift back towards the ballroom. They moved like people in a trance, drawn by a sound they couldn't explain. They gathered at the entrance to the room, peering in. Their faces filled with curiosity and wonder. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling were among them. They had been busy smoothing over the awkwardness caused by their daughter's outburst. But when they heard the music, they stopped. They looked at each other, confused. They knew their daughter was not at the piano. So who was? They pushed through the small crowd and looked into the ballroom. And then they saw him. It was their janitor, the quiet, invisible man who cleaned their house. He was sitting at their priceless Steinway, his eyes closed, his rough, work-worn hands moving across the keys with a grace and passion they had never witnessed before. The music he was creating was breathtaking. It was filled with a depth of feeling that was raw and real and utterly captivating. They stood there, frozen in place along with all their guests. The fireworks continued to explode in the sky outside, but no one was watching. All eyes were on the old man at the piano. He had transformed the instrument from a symbol of cold perfection into a living, breathing thing. The music was a story, and everyone who heard it was a part of it. And then there was Isabel. She had run to the far end of the terrace, trying to escape the suffocating pressure of her parents and their judgmental friends. She stood alone in the darkness, watching the fireworks with unseeing eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally streaming down her face. She felt trapped, like a bird in a cage made of gold and expectations, and then she heard the music. At first, she didn't recognize it. It was so different from the sterile, emotionless notes she was forced to play. This music had a heartbeat. It was filled with a sadness that mirrored her own, but also a sense of hope, a quiet strength that she had never felt before. It was the sound of the piano she had always dreamed of playing, the music she had always wanted to create but never knew how. She slowly turned and walked back towards the ballroom, drawn by the sound. She saw the crowd of guests standing silently at the entrance. She saw the look of shock on her parents' faces. And then she saw him, the janitor. She saw his rough hands, his simple clothes, his closed eyes. He was lost in the music, completely unaware of the audience he had gathered. And in that moment she understood. The piano wasn't the problem. The music wasn't the problem. The problem was the emptiness she had been forced to put into it. This man, this stranger, had filled it with more life and meaning in a few minutes than she had in years of practice. She stood at the back of the crowd, her tears forgotten, a sense of awe washing over her. The music swelled, filling the entire mansion, a powerful, emotional wave that washed over everyone. It was a moment of pure, unscripted magic. A janitor played a rich girl's piano, and in doing so, he touched the hearts of everyone who heard him. The entire party, the entire world of the Sterlings had come to a complete standstill. Seconds later, everyone froze. The last note of the melody hung in the air, a single, shimmering thread of sound that seemed to hold all the sadness and hope in the world. It didn't just fade away. It dissolved slowly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. In the grand ballroom, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if Leo's music had cast a spell, freezing them all in a moment of shared, raw emotion. Leo, his eyes still closed, let his hands rest on the keys. For a few precious seconds he was still lost in the music, still riding the wave of feeling that had carried him away. He was back in his mother's small kitchen, the smell of her cooking in the air, his fingers flying across the keys of their old piano, making her smile. He was free, but then slowly the real world began to seep back in. He became aware of the weight of the silence. He felt the collective gaze of dozens of people upon him. His eyes fluttered open and the spell was broken. The scene before him was a nightmare. The entire party, the city's elite, were standing at the entrance to the ballroom, their faces turned towards him. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite read. Was it awe? Or was it pity? He saw Mr. and Mrs. Sterling at the front of the crowd, their faces pale with disbelief. And standing a little behind them near the back was Isabel. Her face was illuminated by the soft light from the terrace, her eyes wide, her hand covering her mouth. A cold wave of panic washed over him. What had he done? The ghost of the boy who loved music vanished, and in his place stood a 50-year-old janitor who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had touched something that was not his, and in doing so, he had shamed himself and the family who employed him. He slowly pulled his hands away from the keys, as if they were suddenly red hot. He started to stand up, his mind racing, trying to find the words to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But there were no words. The silence was shattered by a voice like thunder. "You!" It was Mr. Sterling. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now flushed with a deep, dark red. His eyes were blazing with a fury that was terrifying to behold. He strode into the ballroom, his expensive shoes echoing loudly on the marble floor. The guests parted like the sea before him. What is the meaning of this? he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling. "How dare you? Get away from there. Get away from that piano this instant." Leo flinched as if he had been struck. He stood up from the bench, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He kept his head bowed, unable to meet the man's eyes. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me. You don't know?" Mr. Sterling scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. He was now standing directly in front of Leo, looming over him. "You are a janitor. You are hired to clean this house, not to touch our things. You are a servant. Do you understand? A servant." The word servant hung in the air, ugly and sharp. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, looking down at their shoes. Mrs. Sterling put a hand on her husband's arm, trying to calm him, but he shook her off. He was too far gone, his pride wounded beyond repair. The embarrassment of his daughter's outburst was now compounded by this trespass. This act of insubordination from a man he considered invisible. "You're fired," Mr. Sterling said, his voice cold and final. "Do you hear me? You are fired. I want you out of this house tonight. Pack your things and get out. You will never work in this city again." Leo felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. He had no savings, no other job prospects. At his age, where would he go? He opened his mouth to say something, to plead for his job, but what could he say? He had been caught red-handed. He had broken the most important rule of his world: stay invisible. He just stood there, his head bowed, accepting his fate. He had had a few moments of beautiful music, a few moments of feeling alive again. Maybe that was worth it. Just as Mr. Sterling was about to turn away, dismissing him as if he were a piece of trash, a voice spoke up. It was quiet at first, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "No, Father?" Wait, it was Isabel. She pushed her way through the stunned crowd. Her blue dress a flash of color in the sea of black suits and evening gowns. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that matched her father's. She walked right up to them and stood between her father and Leo. A human shield. Mr. Sterling stared at his daughter, his fury momentarily replaced by astonishment. "Isabel, what are you doing? This is not your concern. Go back to the party." "No," she said, her voice firmer this time. She looked at Leo, then back at her father. "Don't fire him." "Isabel, I will not tolerate this insubordination in my own house," her father sputtered. "But you don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. He played it beautifully." Her father stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "Beautifully? He made a spectacle of us. He embarrassed us in front of all our friends." "No," she said, shaking her head. "He didn't embarrass us. He showed us something." She turned to look at the piano, then back at the silent, watching crowd. "He played it with more feeling than I ever have." The admission was so quiet, yet it landed in the room with the force of an explosion. A few people gasped. Mrs. Sterling put a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. Mr. Sterling was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Isabel continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I play the notes, but he played the music. My music is empty. It's just a bunch of sounds. But his was full of something. It was full of life, and sadness, and soul. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." She looked at Leo, and for the first time she truly saw him. Not as a janitor, not as a servant, but as a person. A person with a story, with a gift, with a heart. And in that moment he saw her too. Not as a spoiled rich girl, but as a kindred spirit, someone who was also trapped in a cage. The entire dynamic of the confrontation had shifted. It was no longer about a servant overstepping his bounds. It was about a daughter challenging the very foundation of her parents' world, a world built on appearances and perfection. She was defending the beauty of imperfection, the value of raw, unpolished emotion. Mr. Sterling looked at his daughter, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. He looked at the silent, captivated faces of his guests. He looked at the janitor, who stood there with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any anger. The fight seemed to drain out of him. He was suddenly aware of how foolish he looked. How cruel and petty his anger seemed in the face of his daughter's brave and honest defense. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, as the spell of the music was finally, completely broken. The party was over. Not with a bang, but with a melody that no one would ever forget. The silence in the grand ballroom was a heavy blanket, smothering the last echoes of the music and the father's anger. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant crackle of the final fireworks, a pathetic celebration for a party that was well and truly over. The guests stood frozen, their eyes darting between the furious father, the defiant daughter, and the quiet janitor who had unwittingly torn a hole in their perfect evening. It was Mrs. Sterling who finally broke the spell. She put a firm hand on her husband's arm. "That's enough," she said, her voice low but firm, a tone of command he knew well. "The party is over. Let our guests go home." Her words seemed to unlock the room. People began to move, awkwardly at first, then with a sense of relief. They mumbled quiet goodbyes, avoiding direct eye contact with the Sterlings. They didn't talk amongst themselves. There was nothing to say. They had all witnessed something deeply personal and profoundly strange, and they knew it was not their place to gossip. They gathered their things and slipped out of the mansion, leaving behind a trail of empty glasses and a silence that was heavier than before. Soon, the house was empty except for the family and Leo, Mr. Sterling. His anger deflated, looked at his daughter, then at Leo, and then turned and walked away without another word. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Sterling gave Leo a long, unreadable look before following her husband. Isabel stood her ground for a moment longer, her eyes meeting Leo's. There was no pity in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. Then she too turned and disappeared up the grand staircase. Leo was left alone in the cavernous room with the piano. He knew what he had to do. He walked slowly to the small staff room in the basement, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He took a small cardboard box from a corner and began to gather his few belongings from the small metal locker that had been his private space for 15 years. An old jacket, a worn-out book, a framed photograph of his mother. It didn't take long. His life in this house could be packed into a single box. He didn't feel angry or bitter. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost his job, yes, but for a few precious minutes he had found a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. He had played music again, real music, and it had touched someone. He had seen it in the girl's eyes. For the first time in a long time he felt like more than just a janitor. He felt like a musician. He sat on the edge of his cot, waiting for the inevitable footsteps that would tell him to leave. The next morning, Leo woke up early, as he always did. The house was unnervingly quiet. He finished packing his box and carried it upstairs. He planned to leave it by the back door and slip away before anyone was awake. But as he walked through the kitchen, he saw a figure sitting at the large, polished table. It was Isabel. She was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and she looked smaller and younger without her fancy party dress. She was nursing a cup of tea, and she looked up as he entered. He stopped, unsure of what to do. "Miss," he said, his voice quiet. "I was just leaving. You don't have to," she said softly. I talked to my parents." Leo just stood there, his box in his hands, waiting for the verdict. "They were very angry last night," she continued, her eyes fixed on her teacup. "But I told them what I said. I told them that your music was real. I don't think they've ever heard me talk like that before." She finally looked up at him. "Please sit down. Just for a minute." Hesitantly, Leo placed his box on the floor and sat down at the long table, keeping a respectful distance. There was a long silence. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity, not pity. Leo looked at his rough, calloused hands resting on the table. "A long time ago," he began, his voice a little rusty. "Before all this," he gestured vaguely around the grand kitchen. I was young. I had a scholarship to a music school in the city, a conservatory. I thought I was going to be a concert pianist. Isabel leaned forward, her eyes wide. Really? What happened? Life happened, Leo said with a small, sad smile. My mother got very sick. The medical bills were a lot. And my little sister, she was just a baby. Someone had to take care of them. There was no money for lessons, no time for practice. I had to get a job. Any job, so I dropped out. I packed my dreams away in a box, just like this one. He nodded towards his cardboard box on the floor. I never really played again after that. Not until last night. He told her about the old, upright piano in his mother's apartment, how he would play for her when she was feeling down. He told her about the joy he felt, the way the music could transport him to another world. He didn't tell her with any bitterness or regret, but as if he were telling a story about someone else he used to know. Isabel listened intently, her tea forgotten. She had never heard anyone talk about music with such passion and love. For her, it had always been a chore, a tool to gain her parents' approval. As he spoke, Mrs. Sterling walked into the kitchen. She stopped when she saw them sitting there, a world of difference between them, yet connected by the quiet conversation. She didn't say anything, but she stood in the doorway, listening. After a few minutes, she turned and walked away. Later that day, as Leo was once again preparing to leave, Mr. Sterling found him in the ballroom, standing one last time before the piano. Leo braced himself for the final dismissal, but Mr. Sterling didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired and a little bit lost. He cleared his throat. My wife tells me you used to study at the conservatory, he said, his voice gruff. Yes, sir. A long time ago. Mr. Sterling was silent for a moment, looking at the piano, then at Leo. My daughter, she hasn't smiled like that in years. Not a real smile. Not since she was a little girl. He took a deep breath. This is a very difficult thing for me to say. I was wrong. About you. About the music. He looked at Leo, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't friendship, but it was a form of respect. This piano, it doesn't get played with much feeling. It just sits here, looking expensive. My wife and I have discussed it, and we've decided, well, we'd be honored if you would use it, whenever you wish. It seems a shame for it to just sit here. Leo was stunned. He couldn't find the words to respond. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The story doesn't end with a concert or a recording contract. It ends on a quiet afternoon a few weeks later. The sun was streaming through the tall windows of the ballroom, dust motes dancing in the light. Leo was sitting at the piano, and Isabel was sitting beside him on the bench. He wasn't teaching her in a formal way. He was just showing her a simple blues scale, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. Her fingers following his dots. She was playing hesitantly at first, but then she started to relax. A small, genuine smile appeared on her face. It wasn't a perfect, polished sound. It was messy and full of mistakes. But it was also full of something else. It was full of life. It was the sound of two people from different worlds, sharing a common language, bridging the gap between them with a few simple notes played on a grand piano. It was a new duet, and it was more beautiful than any perfect performance she had ever given.